Fijne dag nog.
Doeg.
Nee, het gaat om uitstel van een nog openstaande factuur.
Ja, ik wacht. Heb je een tampon voor me? Alweer?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Ellen, for the introduction earlier. I was going to wait for the end, but I didn't remember how long that took. My name is Maria Carmen Punzi, as Ellen was saying before. I'm delighted you're here today. And I was wondering how I would feel after the short movie. I watched it already, and it made me quite emotional. And I thought if I watch it again, I will not get emotional, and I was wrong. So if my voice is a bit shaky, I'm nervous, but I'm also, this really touched me, and I think and I can imagine that the short movie also touched some of you, or maybe all of you. I'm delighted to be here today because I spent the last about 8 years of my life working on menstrual health and period poverty, which are two different concepts, and we'll explore them today, hopefully mostly with stories and not so much academic input, although that is my background. I mean, I used to be a practitioner. I worked in NGOs for a couple of years, and then I started my PhD journey in academia, and then I started my own consulting business, so I do a little bit of everything. But all of it is concerning menstruation, reproductive rights, women and people who menstruate. And so when I was watching this short movie, I thought, yeah, I know all of this. You know, I've been working on this for very long. But I have to say, when you see the stories of people, even though this is, of course, a fictional story, it's a bit different. Because I think we realize that behind the numbers, 1 in 10 women in the Netherlands does not afford menstrual products every month. Actually, the latest reports say 25% of women and people who menstruate in the Netherlands struggle to afford menstrual products. This is quite staggering, but it's still just a number. And then when we see the stories and when we think about it for ourselves, maybe, or for people we know, or people in our community, our students, our neighbors, it becomes a little bit different. It becomes more human. So I hope that today we can mostly talk about the human side of period poverty, but also turn this to be a positive story. And that's the reason why I was really happy when Ellen approached me, by now I think almost 6 months ago, and in her pitch there was also the word menstrual health. So I'm gonna just do by a quick show of hand, how many people thought they knew what period poverty was before the event today? I'm not gonna call you out on it, but just to get a sense. Okay, about 75%. We'll talk about what period poverty is defined as. And what about menstrual health? Do you think you can have your own definition of menstrual health? Okay. Less confidence, a few nodding. Okay, so, well, period poverty doesn't have an official definition yet, but let's say that we can agree that it's the inability to regularly access and afford adequate menstrual products, adequate sanitation facilities, and stigma-free education. Now, I'm using now my own definition, but let's say that this is what most scholars and practitioners agree to. And there's 2 key words here: regularly, and also both afford and access. So it's not just about, you know, it's the only people that are experiencing period poverty are not just the people that are completely living below the poverty line and cannot afford to have, for example, a roof on top of their head, but it's also people like Ruby and families like Ruby's where, you know, they can afford to send their kids to school, they have clothes, but you can see also they go to the food bank, if I understood correctly what I watched in the movie, and they also have to really make count, let's say, the expenses. And another important part of period poverty, I think, when I read, especially in Dutch newspapers or on social media, period poverty, I think most people, and it's normal that this is the case, assume that this is about affording products. But as we know, products is just one of the components of having a good menstrual health. So actually, the interesting thing is that while we don't have an official period poverty definition, we do have an official menstrual health definition as of 2021. But as I can see, academics don't reach the general public because this was published a few years ago. And basically, what a few important scholars in the field agreed on is that menstrual health is a state of complete physical, emotional, psychological health when it comes to the menstruation, which means having access to products, but also to an enabling environment, which means, again, sanitation facilities, but also no shame and stigma in your surrounding. I don't know how many of you here menstruate, but I can say as a person who's been menstruating for about 18 years of her life, there are so many things that come up when it comes to menstruation. It's not simply affording the products, but it's also becoming aware of your own body and becoming aware of what it means to need certain things when it comes to your body. It means also worrying, and you saw it in the short movie. One of the things I like the most, and I'm going to ask you later what struck you the most, but I think one of the most interesting scenes for me was when Ruby met her friend, and her friend wanted to gossip/talk about their girl thing, and she could not focus on it because she was too busy with herself thinking like, am I leaking, or maybe I have to ask a product, and the friend says, again, so this has happened before. And I think this is a perfect example of how just thinking about products or just thinking about people who are poor and live in the street, or people from the global south, or even people from just poor countries is not enough. When I started working on this, and I was talking about the taboo around menstruation, people would say, yeah, but this only happens in Africa, right? And well, first of all, Africa is, of course, hundreds of millions of people and different cultures. But I was also thinking, yeah, but I mean, I grew up in Italy, and there were still stories around. I remember someone telling me, you should not wash your hair while you're menstruating, and I never understood the connection. I'm not sure what it was, if I shouldn't shower because my flow would stop. I don't even remember. But throughout the years, I've had conversations about menstruation with most people I've met, and I actually heard the most interesting stories. So in France, for example, there is an old tale that you should not try to make mayonnaise when you're menstruating because it can go bad. Same, actually, south of Italy, some old nonnas, I mean, I don't know if they still say it, but the tale is that you should not try to make tomato salsa like when menstruating, because again, it can go bad. I heard some Indian women talking about how you should not touch plants or care for plants when menstruating because they will wilt. Or also touch pickles. I think there was something about pickles, but I don't remember super well. And also, of course, this becomes more extreme when we think about practices that actually are quite marginalizing women and people who menstruate. So actually, the way I got into this topic is when I was 20, and I was actually doing my exchange semester in Rotterdam. That's where I also live. I read online from this Italian magazine that translates articles from different countries and different languages, an article about a practice called chopadi. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. That is present in Western Nepal. So not all of Nepal, but just a small part of Western Nepal. By which women, when they're menstruating, they are not allowed to sleep in their own house or cook their own food or sleep in the same room as their husband because they are considered impure. What fascinated me about the practice when I learned initially about it is I thought, oh, well, this has everything to do with gender equality. Because, yeah, of course, then once a month for a few days, you're actually not supposed to be in contact with other people because you are polluting, essentially. But as the years went by, I started thinking about this, and I started also thinking and trying to understand what it means for us to menstruate as women and as people who menstruate, and how much energy that takes from our body. So what I realized is that some of these practices actually started from a desire to let women rest. and not have to care for their partner, for example, so then you're allowed to sleep on your own, or have to care for your family, so you're not allowed to cook for all the rest of the people. But then turned over the years, and perhaps with colonization, we'll never know exactly how things went there, into marginalization practices. So I think that's at least what's most interesting for me when it comes to menstruation is, on one hand, we consider it a taboo, something that we should not talk about, something that, even though things are changing in the last years, it's something that when I ask most people, especially in a public setting, people are not really sharing, and especially if they're a little bit older. I find that Gen Zers are actually quite open when it comes to menstruation. I don't know who identifies as a Gen Zer here. But I think the other side of it is actually that it's a huge part of our life, because without menstruation, we know, of course, we would not be here. None of us would be here. It's basically the essential physiological phenomenon that allows all of us to be born. So hence the fascination. And for something so precious to basically sustain human life, we treat it quite badly. So of course, we're starting today from a concept of period poverty, which is the lack of support, essentially, if you think about it. So the fact that when we go to a public library, the chances that toilet paper is free is quite high. The chances that you will find emergency menstrual products is very low. Now, things have been changing in the last couple of years. I know in Maastricht, I think the university now has some aangiftepunten, right? Like there are some places where you can get menstrual products, and it's often these are grassroots initiatives. But these are things that have had to be pushed mostly by the people that have experienced menstruation. And I think what really struck me the more I work on the topic is that we go through life in a society that is not designed for a menstruating body. That doesn't mean that all men are bad. That doesn't mean that all people in power have been bad and have hated women. Some of them definitely have, but that's a different story. But it's more about the awareness, right? Like bringing the topic to the surface, like realizing like this is not something that we are aware of. And I have to say, I have 4 male brothers, so you can imagine the interesting conversation. They're all younger than me, and they've been very well trained into all things menstrual cycle. They even know the different phases of the menstrual cycle, which is an advanced level of learning. But I think what's interesting is I've not received a lot of pushback from men when talking about menstruation, when explaining what period poverty entails, when explaining what the menstrual cycle entails. I've actually, sometimes met blank faces, fine. Sometimes curiosity. And that also made me realize that we're doing a disservice to everyone, not just women and people who menstruate, when we exclude those that don't menstruate from the conversation. And we're never going to change this institutional kind of society if we are not talking to everyone about the topic. So for me, it's pressing that we don't talk about menstruating as a disadvantage, or that we don't talk about it as something that requires, in a way, like special attention. It requires to be understood. But there's some fascinating studies that basically show that whatever productivity you lose, and I'm talking in kind of capitalist term, at menstruation, you're gaining back at ovulation if you're cycling naturally. So if you're ovulating, basically the surge of hormones around ovulation makes up, and again here I'm using strong terms, for the productivity that you may lose at menstruation. And why do I say this? Because I think in these times where the rights of women and other marginalized communities are clearly under threat in many places of the world, I think we have to be very careful when we talk about hormones, and when we talk about changes throughout the cycle, and when we talk about the needs that we need, the needs that need to be supported for women and those who menstruate. So my main claim here is menstruation doesn't make women and people who menstruate weaker. It doesn't make them more fragile. It doesn't make them less reliable. But of course, if you've designed society for one single kind of individual, which is not even the men, but it's the cis man that is wealthy, that is healthy, that is from a certain class, that is from a certain religious, that is white, that's going to exclude a very big group of people. Also including, for example, men that have chronic illnesses, men that go through an infertility journey, or men that don't have a high-paying job, or men that are from a so-called low class. So why am I going so broad? Because I think what menstrual health and period poverty have taught me is that these are just like entry points. Are entry points to talk about inequality in society. That's why I say menstrual health is a wonderful example in a way of how when you talk about one thing, you start talking about all the other things. So the reason why I was so struck by the short film, and then I will ask you about what struck you about it, hopefully something spoke to you, is that I've seen girls write like Ruby all the time. Like I live in Rotterdam, there's like high diversity of people in the street. Even in the neighborhood I live in, you see people of different backgrounds, people you can kind of tell from different social classes. And what I suspect is that many of these people lack good menstrual health. And whether that's menstrual products or that's stigma-free education or an enabling environment where their parents or their peers or their teachers have explained to them that menstruation is a natural physiological process, that it's actually a window to your health, that it's a sign that you're healthy. If you're menstruating, it means that you're eating enough. In fact, people that are under feeding themselves stop menstruating often. But I'm sure that many of them, however they look like and whichever family they look like, they do miss one piece of menstrual health and therefore can be categorized as belonging to the group of people that experience period poverty. So I will take just like a breather because I know I can tend to speed up through this. And I just want to know if anyone wants to share, and if not, we'll move on. But is there anything that touched you or spoke to you or you were surprised by in the short movie? And if you want to share why, and I'll take just a sip of water. You can just show to Ellen if you want to share.
You can raise your hand if you want to say something, or if you want to think about if you want to say something. Come to you.
I think what struck me the most was the use of cardboard. I think it was at the beginning when she did not have tampon to use, and that is, I think it was cardboard, but I can imagine how uncomfortable that was and how insecure she must have felt even walking from home to her school. And I think that struck me the most, and I was like, wow, that was physically and probably emotionally very painful for her.
Thank you for sharing.
Come to you.
Hi, I think what struck me most was when Ruby obviously wants to not be the burden for her mother and the family. And while they were in the supermarket and she was, trying to, the receipt for the empty bottles, and the mom kind of forgot about it and she didn't want to mention it. And I think that was really, really painful, and that touched me a lot.
Yeah, I agree. I also.
Yes.
Thank you. For me, it was this scene from the physical education class when the young boy started screaming that Ruby is bleeding. I think it's crazy how this stigma actually begins in childhood when people are still kids. And I'm wondering if it stems from lack of education around menstruation, or maybe from the attitudes of adults around the children.
Yeah, I think that's a comment and a question in one, so maybe I can briefly respond to that, and then we can take other comments if need be. I mean, of course, we are not born with the shame of menstruation inside of us, so it's something that we learn, but I think we underestimate how early we can pick that up, because I think that's also something that is so subtle sometimes in advertisements, and things of course are changing right now, but I mean I remember even just 10-15 years ago, we were talking about it earlier, seeing this advertisement with women wearing very tight white pants, and then the promise of the menstrual product was, well, no one's gonna know you're bleeding, and we have a very silent rapper, so don't worry about this, and you can do cartwheels in the fields in white, which is the dream of every menstruating person in the world. But indeed, I think it's something that is used. In a way, I think menstruation has a sort of mystery around it, we don't understand it very well. So I think also for kids, same way as with the body and sex, and like it's this exploration of like no one is really talking to me about it, and I can make fun of it. Sometimes it's also a way to express a need of like, what is this? No one, because I think when things get normalized, they become less interesting to young people to tease about. That at least would be my guess, to actually not make it a thing. So I do think that indeed it's very important, and that's one of the things that I think when it comes to what can we do about this? What can you do about this? It's very important to me that you walk away today not with this sense of we're doomed, and of course there's a lot of very discouraging, I think, insights when it comes to period poverty. I've been working recently on a European research report about period poverty, and it really struck me how many millions of women and people who menstruate cannot afford good menstrual products. They say that they avoid school toilets or work toilets because they are not adequate to change products. They say that they find it unprofessional to talk about menstruation at work. They say that their biggest fear is to stain their pants. And this is across board, like Germany, Estonia, Finland, Sweden, you name it. It's really something that brings us all together. This is quite interesting. But I also have seen in my own life and the life of the people that work on this topic that once you start a conversation, people want to have this conversation. I mean, it's really striking how there is this silent need, I would say, and sometimes not so silent if you're on social media and if you're in certain circles, to actually ask these questions. Because I think something that is not shown in the short movie, because it's not about that, is that one of the consequences of the silence around menstruation and around period poverty is that lots of menstrual diseases and morbidities go undetected. There's a lot of people that suffer from real menstrual disorders like endometriosis, for example, but also adenomyosis and polycystic ovary syndrome and many other connected morbidities that don't get diagnosed or get undiagnosed or get referred too late. Like endometriosis, which basically the conservative estimate is that 1 out of 10 women worldwide has it, takes on average 7 years to be diagnosed. And this affects women and people that like pass out from pain, they cannot go to work, they cannot go to school, they bleed like through products they have to change every 2 hours. So this is also, we saw the story of someone that actually had, I think, a semi-normal menstrual cycle, let's say semi-average, but you have to think this for the women and people that have abnormal menstrual cycles, because they do exist. So very unpredictable, so you really cannot know when it's coming, or very, very heavy, so you need double the products, or also bringing about things like infertility, for example. So the silence around menstruation is not just, okay, yeah, but you can just buy a cheaper products, right? Like this is the comment I get, I mean, not for myself, but when I talk about menstruation and period poverty, people say, yeah, but it's 90 cents at the HEMA, right? Like the small tampon box with 10. And to that I say, like, do we talk about anything else like that? do we talk about any other fundamental need like that? Oh yeah, but it's 90 cents at the Lidl. Yeah, of course, it's 90 cents at the Lidl, but then, first of all, there are families that are counting euro by euro. That's one thing. And the second thing is, why would I buy a product or a brand whose ingredients are not transparent, who may irritate me, or which, the standards around menstrual products are also quite untransparent. So I think it's important to push back when it comes to people that minimize the issue. So if you are ever in conversation, if you ever tell anyone about the event that you've been to, I think it's important to say, like, yeah, but this is actually affects a lot of people, and why shouldn't we talk about it, right? And it can start really small, because of course, I mean, not all of us want to dedicate their whole life to menstruation, although I highly recommend it. It's a very fun ride. But it's also, we are having consistently conversation, for example, about how do we make a certain environment comfortable for people, right? And I see it more and more in restaurants and cafes that their standard menstrual products are there suddenly now in toilets. Why is that? Because activists and groups and students and young people have been talking about this. The change doesn't happen from above. I can tell you it goes from below up, but things are indeed shifting. So I also like that in some of friends' houses, for example, there's just like always menstrual products available also for guests, which, you know, it's just an emergency thing. You don't necessarily need it. And maybe if it's your friend, they're going to ask you. But just making that bit so much easier. You're like, oh, there's no barrier. We don't even have to have a conversation about it because we acknowledge that you cannot predict when you're getting your period. And so it might happen when you're at a friend's house or at a friend of a friend, which is a bit more awkward. I think the second thing is also really believing people's experiences. I mean, I think that the reason why I like the short film so much is that this is something that people don't very easily talk about. And why that is, it's also because to the shame of menstruation, it mixes in the shame of poverty. And this is also, of course, a cycle. And it's interesting that there's the scene of the food bank, because I've actually talked with someone that worked at the food bank in Rotterdam, and she told me that they actually did not include menstrual products in the package for the families because they don't know, they're not allowed to know the gender division within the family. So it's a matter of anonymity and keeping like the family anonymity. And that struck me as well because I thought, yeah, this is of course a well-intended policy. It's not that you should be able to identify who's who. But this, of course, no one had this in mind. There is no. It could also be that there's a standard menstrual product package in every single bag, because the likelihood that there is no woman in the family is kind of low. But that's not the standard, right? That's what I'm talking about. It's like the standard is to erase menstruation, or at least ignore it or forget it. So just, I think, to bring this topic into conversation and to ask yourself, like, okay, for myself, for the people around me that might have a menstrual cycle, what can I do? Is there anything that I can offer? For example, I mean, I think also having always like a hot water bottle available for yourself, but also for friends. Same at the office. I mean, I think it's really nice to think of like small spots in the office. It doesn't have to be an extensive one. I mean, we have very few and too few lactation rooms. We have sometimes like prayer or meditation rooms. Is there any room to, for example, lay down for 5 minutes if you're having really bad back cramps, for example? I used to have a friend that like would have to kind of lay down when menstruating, even just a few minutes per day. So she wanted to come to the office, but then she was just not really able to stretch. And then we used to have like very transparent doors, so it would look very weird if she would just like be on the floor. So just like also these design ideas, right? Like of like how are our spaces welcoming or not welcoming of people who menstruate? I think the third thing is, of course, education. And I mean, you're already ahead because you're here and hopefully you're learning something, but this is just the beginning because like 45 minutes will not suffice, I think. And what I mean by that is not, you don't have to go and buy a book about menstrual health, although I have several to recommend. And if you find me online, you'll see that I talk about my favorites. So you can just look it up from there. But I think to really be curious, right? Even if you're menstruating yourself, even if you stopped menstruating, even if you never menstruated, even if you don't have at the moment people in your life that menstruate, I think to have this awareness that people around you might be experiencing this is really important. And it really changes the game because it also makes you realize that we don't live in a linear body and in a linear life. I think that's also one of the reasons why talking, I think, about the menstrual cycle is so controversial to a certain extent, is that we, by now, live in a superlinear society. I mean, we work in a superlinear way from 9 to 5 and 6 for most of us, from Monday to Friday. And that's, you know, it's the cycle that repeats itself again and again. But of course, if you're living in a menstruating body, you are not normally on hormonal birth control, you experience actually ups and downs. The same way that if you've had a pregnancy, you will see that during the pregnancy and after, things don't look like this. And I think to talk about cycles and to talk about changing and to talk about unpredictability in a very linear world is quite hard. And in a way, it's quite revolutionary. But I think that the beautiful thing is that you all can do it, whether you have a menstrual cycle or not. It's something that goes back to, am I listening to my body? Because I think most women that menstruate and most people that menstruate are asked to forget about menstruation, right? Like, I mean, I think this is also what we see in the short movie. I think ideally it wouldn't exist in this context, right? It looks like a burden. It looks like something that it's costly. It makes me not play softball or handball or whatever they were playing at my best. It makes my mom, worry about the price of the groceries, and it becomes this burden. And I really love that the last, part is about this is not your responsibility. Like, it should not be a burden to menstruate, and it should not be a burden to live in a cyclical body in a way. So I think to ask yourself, if you menstruate yourself, how do you bring compassion to that, knowing that you've been asked most of your life, most likely, and then depending on the context in different ways, to pretend it's not there, right? To work through the pain, go to school through the pain, make up an excuse, say that you have a stomach ache rather than a uterus pain. There is not really even a word for it. I mean, yeah, there is menstrual pain, but we don't say my uterus is hurting, or to just minimize the symptoms just because we don't want to look weak, or we don't want to look like, we are less, for example, valuable member of the team. I understand that those are real concerns, but I think that's why I think that the first element to bring in is really this compassion towards yourself and towards other people. I have a lot of conversation with young people, particularly that kind of complain or reflect on what their parents taught them. But I think, we also have to bring compassion to them or to the people that raise you, to your caretakers, because, I think everyone is trying, for the most part, the best that they can. And if I see what kind of education, the generation before me, or even 2 generations before me got, there's not much more that they could do. But this is where it changes, right? I think most of you, if you know a little bit about period poverty, you've seen this is in the news now. And I can assure you 10 years ago, this was not as much. And 5 years ago, it was not as much. So there is a wave of awareness, and you can be part of that wave. And I think it's really important to come to that from a place of hope rather than a place of hopelessness, which of course already characterizes, I think, most of our society, this sense of, well, what can I do? I've also worked in sustainability, and that's also, there's not a lot to hope about. But I think particularly when it comes to menstrual health and women's health more generally, I think there's so much wisdom in the body, and there is so much room for understanding other cultures and other people when it comes to hearing their menstrual stories. And I'll say one thing before I open it up to you again. I told Ellen this during dinner that last year in May, I did my first ever workshop in Dutch, which was also a humbling experience. It went okay, but it was a very different situation for a group of women in a community center in the south of Rotterdam. And for those of you that don't know, the south of Rotterdam is, let's say, the poorest part of the city. Actually, I think it's the poorest zip code in the whole of the Netherlands. And this was a community center that basically brought together mostly Algerian, Turkish, Moroccan, Surinamese, and I think Indonesian women. And we had a really nice mix. And this was an initiative of the university to take the researchers out of the ivory tower and into the city. Very nice. I did not know what to expect. And I thought, that these women, they probably feel very ashamed about their menstruation. I have to be very careful. And I don't know, because, I guess some Muslim women might not even want to talk about it. I was completely wrong. These women took stage. They wanted the microphone. They told all this. It was an all-women room, to be fair, and they asked it to be so. But I was so surprised by the fact that actually they loved talking about this. They were very excited. They were explaining to me and to the rest of the women how they were changing the kind of stories that they learned, in terms of when they were, educating their kids and particularly their sons, that they were sending their sons to buy their menstrual product, and I felt very, I felt very ignorant, I have to say, because I thought, here I come, with my prejudices, even though I know this, I've worked in the Global South, I know that a lot of the stories and the stereotypes that we have are actually unfounded. But this was really a powerful moment because I realized, this is where the conversation actually makes room for really understanding each other, instead of saying, period poverty probably affects those other people, right? Or like the taboo of menstruation, probably those that believe those stories are the uneducated or the poor. Because I know that many of us, if not most of us, in the end think that. But I think there's such power in questioning those assumptions, even though it's very hard. I acknowledge that, and it's been very hard for me to also be in that position and realize, of course, depending on your privilege, your experience of menstruation will be very different. But what I did also learn is that your privilege doesn't protect you from the taboo of menstruation. Like the fact that you have access to the menstrual products and the good hygiene facilities, and even sometimes the education, doesn't prevent you from feeling shameful about it, which I think is fascinating. And sometimes if you have lower means and you have to be more confronted with menstruation, then you have to face it. For example, even for me, it was very interesting when I moved to the Netherlands that basically none of my friends here use pads. And I was like, why? What is the problem with pads? Yeah, but you don't want to have it there, right? It's very icky. And I thought, in Italy, everyone used pads. When I was living there, I was like, I think I just switched from pads to menstrual cups, so I never went through the tampons. But I couldn't really figure out what it was. And I don't want to say that you should use pads to break the taboo, because you should use whatever feels comfortable to you. But I think we make so many assumptions just based on what's normal for us. And I think that's also important to realize that to change the conversation, we have to change how we think about it as such. And to start questioning okay, but how do I feel about this? And how could I support other people? And I think both truths can, stay true, which is one, so many people are affected by period poverty worldwide, even in Europe, even in the Netherlands. I said this number from the Neighborhood Feminists, which is this period poverty organization that is based in Amsterdam, is 25% of Dutch women. This is 1 in 4. It's a crazy number, and it's not 1 in 4 experiences period poverty all the time, but struggles to afford menstrual products monthly. And this is a number that should not, exist. It should not be the problem, right? And so I think, the encouragement from my side is let's be moved, but also let's be aware that one single conversation can become a ripple effect. In this sense, I feel more hope for the future of menstrual health that I feel about other topics, and that's because I have seen how quickly it can change. And I really believe that you don't need a doctorate in menstrual health, again, luckily, don't go there, but to change things. You can have this with friends, you can have with family members, and I really believe that it doesn't take that much. And of course, we can talk about lobbying and advocating, but that's maybe for a separate conversation. I want to hear a little bit if we do have any comments or questions or shares, because I know that the time is flying and it's already almost 9. So I will take another sip of water. If anyone wants to raise questions, but also comments and reactions, I'm very happy to hear.
Yeah, I'll come to you.
Hi, thank you so much. This was great. First of all, I just want to say a few words about the movie. For me, it conveys a lot of anxiety. So even for us who generally have had access to menstrual products, if you've been in a situation where you've run out and you're thinking, are the stores open? And just that momentary anxiety. So I can imagine having that constantly every single month. I just want to know, in terms of what's being done to address period poverty, it appears that maybe everything is geared towards looking at, you know, having menstrual products everywhere and that sort of thing. But how are we doing on a global scale in terms of, for example, not having women work during their period if they want to? Is there sort of a mapping of policies globally? Like, how are we doing with that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'll address this before we go to the rest, or do we take all of them? No, I'll do one.
You
by
can
one.
just address it.
Yeah. Yeah, the anxiety, I completely hear you. And I mean, I still also remember asking in middle school my friends, like, can you check my bag? Like, have I stained myself? Even if I had all the products. So it's also, I think it's a very recognizable situation, even if not as extreme. And in terms of what's being done, I mean, it's a huge conversation, of course, globally. I agree. I think the criticism that I also have, and other, I think, experts have as well, is that the product conversation has been in the driving seat. In a way, it's not surprising because that's where the money is at, to a certain extent. I mean, my own PhD is about like social enterprises, so social businesses trying to change menstruation. So that's, I guess, like business with a social mission. So I think, in a way, that's also an important conversation to have, that there are brands and companies that are trying to make menstrual products more accessible, safer, of better quality, and more widespread. But I do think that what we have seen as well is that in some places, for example, in a few countries, there's been like free schemes. So where the government or the municipality distributes free menstrual products to especially young girls through schools in need. And what we've seen with the qualitative data is that girls don't want the poor people pads. They want the branded pads. They want the pads that feel like empowered, you know, that make them feel like it's a beauty product. And I completely understand. I mean, I cannot relate to that experience of being like in those situations, but I can totally see this. And I can totally see that we don't want to transform this into a dependency or a dependence on, well, this free product scheme that will come from the government. Who knows when it's stopping? Because this is much more of a grounded, like, systemic issue. But at the same time, there's a lot of small and medium-scale education programs, both with girls and boys, across countries, I think particularly in the Global South because of funding reasons, that try to explain how menstruation is a natural process. So education is there. I think it's hard to get money for it, to be honest. And when it comes to women in the workplace, I mean, that's my whole other area of expertise. Again, we can talk about this at length, but I mean, Spain was the first country in Europe, but definitely not the first country in the world, because South Africa was there, and Japan, I think, and Korea, among others, implementing menstrual leave. So that's menstruatieverlof, where if you're experiencing painful periods and your GP classifies it as painful periods, huge red flag, you can get up to, I think, 3 days per month of additional leave. The issue there is that actually this should not be considered a special leave. This should just be sick leave. If you're not able to come to work because you're menstruating, probably you have a menstrual disorder. I would take a wild guess. And I think it's particularly difficult then to see, like, okay, what happens when it comes to hiring practices? Like, am I being discriminated against because it's on my CV, or not CV, sorry, but on my profile that I have this permission in theory to take extra leave? So I think that an assessment of this menstrual leave that showed that after 2 years, only a very, very, very small percentage of Spanish women applied for it, which doesn't surprise me, because it's already we are disadvantaged enough, I think, in the workplace. So it's a tricky conversation. I think the most successful stories I've seen is where there's a holistic programming, or holistic projects, so menstrual products combined with education, combined with peer-to-peer education, combined with the adults need to be in the conversation, because if you're home, and we were talking about how are kids influenced. I mean, if you're home and your parents are talking about menstruation in a super degrading way, no matter what you hear at school on social media, I mean, you're gonna be influenced with that. But I think there's amazing work being done also on social media. I mean, the conversation is absolutely there. And also when it comes to, for example, advocacy for better menstrual product standards, we're working toward, well, I mean, not me personally, the field is working towards a global standardization of menstrual products, which doesn't exist, which is insane. And also just in general, like recognition, like, I mean, the reason why I started with this topic is the SDGs, like the Sustainable Development Goals don't mention menstruation at all. It's not mentioned in hygiene and water. It's not mentioned in education. It's not mentioned in gender equality. And I remember because it was 2016, so the year they started, let's say, I thought, this is odd. But now the United Nations is talking about it, the EU is talking about it, so the progress is there, but I think it's important that, we also add our own effort to it, because every effort counts in this case. Thank you for your comment.
Do we have other comments or questions? Yeah. Can you maybe pass?
Well, I was wondering, since you just addressed that a GP qualifies someone as like having a painful menstruation, do we quantify that in some sort of way? I get that everyone experiences their menstruation their own type of way, but in terms of like education, are there some kind of guidelines that are expressed with it, so people who menstruate know like that what they experience is normal or qualified as abnormal?
Yeah. So there are some. So with pain is more difficult because pain is invisible in a way. But I think, for example, with amount of bleeding, we do have the guidelines. So if you have to change more often than 2-3 hours your product because you're bleeding through, that's like abnormal bleeding, for example. In theory, you should be able to conduct a normal life when menstruating. So if you're unable to go out of bed without like a strong painkiller, if you're passing out, I have several friends who told me, I used to pass out because of menstruation, then they put me on the pill, and I'm always like, oh my God, because and they say with the most normal expression, like, and then they just put me on the pill because I was passing out and I didn't want to pass out all the time. I was like, okay, well, that's a bit worrying. So in terms of like, I guess we can see the manifestation of the pain. I think where the gender and socialization lens comes in is that we are taught very young that the pain is part of being in a female body. So I think it's like where we have to deconstruct is like, okay, I mean, I always laugh when we talk about the man flu, right? Like we always, at least I laugh with my girl, I don't know if anyone else laughs, but about the fact that men complain about their symptoms more quickly. And we kind of like make jokes about it, but maybe it's right that they do so, because we have been taught as females, if you're socialized as a female, that you shouldn't complain. And there's studies on this where, like when you're at the ER, if you're a man, it's just like about 20 minutes quicker to get a painkiller if you're complaining about pain than if you're a woman. So that's why I'm always like, biology and socialization are not like two parallel ways, they intersect. So I think that the difficult part is that there's a history of GPs, and not because they're bad, but because of how they are trained, of not identifying menstrual pain as a concerning thing. And I think people that menstruate are not taught how to identify what's normal, because you live in your own body and you've experienced it once. And even more, I will say, because things like endometriosis are genetically, like there's normally, if you have it, your mom has it and your grandma has it, there's a normalization of, this is how it is in our family. Like I've heard this more often, like, of course, my grandma also used to pass out, and I also used to pass out, all was well in the end. Because sometimes with pregnancy, actually symptoms get better. So people are like, just get pregnant. Not the cheapest way to get over your menstrual pain. But so I think that indeed a review also of GP and in general, like also gynecologists and endocrinologists, so hormone specialist standards, should be done also on the basis of new evidence, because talking to people who went through medical training, the guidelines are really like old-fashioned. They have not been updated with what we know now about menstrual pain. And for example, all the insights around chronic pain and how to like do, for example, pain reprocessing therapy. This could be, I think, super helpful for menstrual pain, but we often don't work in an interdisciplinary way. So my hope is that it's gonna happen, but we will see if that's actually the case.
Other questions? I have a question. You mentioned a lot about our own responsibility to talk about and to make action visible, let's say. What is, in your opinion, the responsibility of the workplace that we go to when we are menstruating, or when we're women, or people who menstruate, or the schools in this?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a basis, understanding that like a very good percentage of their the people that are there, so either in school or in the workplace, actually go through this. And I think just maybe starting from rethinking spaces. So really the classroom, how many bathroom breaks you're allowed to take. Because I remember also you had to hold pee until like whatever 11:15 because you were not allowed to go to the toilet when I was in school. This was the case. And same for workplaces. So sometimes, you know, back-to-back meetings with absolutely zero moments to like take a second of break and just go to the toilet, for example, or the possibility to work from home sometimes in the month. I think there's a responsibility there to make working and particularly studying accessible and available and comfortable for everyone. And that doesn't just mean people who menstruate, but of course also people that have, for example, chronic pain or that have a disability of any sort. I think when we start talking about health in the workplace and well-being, I mean, this brings us to many other groups as well. But I think first and foremost, the acknowledgement and the education, because I wouldn't want workplaces to think like, okay, another thing. Now we also have to pick the menstrual products. Now we also have to put the 15 minutes bathroom break. Yeah, and what else do they want? Like, I mean, that's the kind of conversation I've also had, to be honest, with people. But in the end, I mean, we've advocated, for example, at Erasmus University in Rotterdam for menstrual products on campus. So now there's a few locations on campus with free menstrual products for students and employees. And we did a survey to figure out, like, okay, how do people feel about this? And people have really said, like, yeah, I was very happy that I could take the products before my exam, or like, it mostly, like, it relieves this anxiety that you were talking about. And it's what I also tell, especially companies, when I work with companies, there's this fear that the employees will take all the products and bring them home. This is the biggest fear of the finance department of any company in the Netherlands. No, I'm exaggerating, of course, but I'm like, why are we worried about it? And also, if your employees are not paid enough to afford menstrual products, maybe you're the problem. But it's really this kind of changing the perspective. I like, it's not your responsibility. Like, is it really a person's responsibility to buy emergency menstrual products for the office? Then why is it not for toilet paper? Why are we not all bringing toilet paper to the office? And it makes, of course, us laugh but the only difference there is that everyone has to use the toilet paper, or everyone has to use the soap, or everyone has to dry their hands. But then why coffee? Why is coffee available in workplaces and menstrual products? No. I would leave it to that.
Yes.
Thank you. I was wondering, because when I was watching the short film, I kept thinking about when she either used a cardboard or stayed like sitting in the blood for a lot longer than necessary, or wash and reuse a tampon. I kept feeling worried that they would reveal that she got an infection or that she got something as a result of that. And it didn't happen in the short film, but I can imagine that not having proper access then creates aggravated consequences to the lack of menstrual products. How frequent do you think it is, and how well-equipped is currently the health system to counteract that?
Well, it's not well-equipped, I can tell you that. But I mean, how frequent, it's hard to tell. But I mean, the studies we do have are about toxic shock syndrome, which happens basically when you keep your your internal absorbent menstrual products too long. So it happened with tampons already in the 70s. There were basically some scandal where some products were too absorbent and they were kept on for too long, and they brought about toxic shock syndrome, and I think a few people lost their legs even. I mean, this was super extreme, and those products were recalled, so that's not a risk anymore. But you really shouldn't wear your menstrual product, mostly your tampon, for longer than it's indicated in on the package. I think how often, it's very hard, and I think you know why it's hard, because it's hard to measure, because people won't tell, because there's a shame around who's gonna tell you openly yeah, I use cardboard or I use what we do have is like narrative accounts of I use newspapers, the data I reviewed for this European Parliament research report was, well, I use diapers, I use old menstrual products that I find in toilets that are not super used. I use just paper, I use toilet paper, of course. And I mean, I used to think, okay, but these are all very extreme stories, but now I see it over and over and over and over again across countries, across continents. And I'm like, okay, maybe we should talk about this, because I used to think, okay, maybe these are a bit too sensationalist, maybe we are framing this a bit too strong, but actually, well, I mean, this is what the people are telling us, and I don't think anyone would make this up, because it's not a good look on anyone, to be honest. So, and in terms of the medical system, I mean, I think that's actually where one of the biggest issues lays, because they are also not really told. They're not really able to spot sometimes like menstrual disorders, so even infections created by the incorrect use of menstrual products. And so this is, again, not to blame the medical system, but to say, well, we need different menstrual education also for practitioners, because you understand that this is such a silence and marginalized topic that basically not even the experts are really expert. And what I see, because I've been online talking about this for the past 7 years, is that people come to me. I have 0 medical degree, and I always tell I cannot give medical advice. And everyone, like people in my DMs are like, hey, I'm having this experience, what should I do? I'm like, well, I really cannot tell you, but you should go to a GP about this. And for me, the fact that strangers feel like they can come talk to another stranger also speaks, I don't want to say of desperation, but definitely of a lack of places to ask questions. And so it's really compelling, I think, to partner. For example, I do some research with a gynecologist from Italy. I think it's super important to bring different voices together, because doctors also have only so much time for their patients, and the burden should not be fully on them, of course, but they're an important gatekeeper for sure when it comes to tests, for example, and other diagnoses. Where are we with time? 9:50.
Yes. Thank you. I just want to share that I work at this university, and I work at the Diversity and Inclusivity Office, and we're one of the organizers of the free menstrual products at this university. So I just wanted to share that there are about 25 little cabinets around campus, and we're still trying to expand. So I hope you already knew all this, and that it sometimes maybe saves you. And we're working on it to really implement it in the entire university. It used to be a project, and now it's embedded in the structure. So hopefully we will publish about it soon, but you should be able to already see it around campus. So, and if there's any questions, or there's missing products, or there's you need more cabinets, just let us know. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and congratulations. Yeah, I feel like that also deserved an applause. I felt amazing.
That's very good to know. Another question next to you.
I don't know how to put it, but I wonder, I'm old now and I don't have menstruation anymore, so I'm very happy about that, but that's another story. But I wonder if all the mothers and fathers that have sons, if they would be more open about it, and if the sons of those mothers would be normalized with the fact that their mother menstruates, that there would be less problems in the work atmosphere, because mainly the men are the ones that are deciding about it, about rules, about having coffee for free. You know, I wonder if, I don't know if that is a solution, of course, but
it's
it keeps me busy in my mind and thinking about it.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely one of the solutions, right? I mean, as I was saying before, I'm really wary of kind of putting the blame / the responsibility on one category only, because I think this is such a complex topic and we need everyone on board, so we don't want to alienate anyone in a way, and I'm not saying that you are, but I do think that indeed, to make this issue normal, and this starts also from books or TV shows mentioning it, like in passing. It doesn't have to be like a whole TV show about menstruation, but it's just like the normalization. If you think about this, how many times do you see menstruation in just general movies, even just like romances? Even, it doesn't even have to be action movie, but you don't, right? And that's when it becomes a problem. And the first time you see it, maybe then it becomes like something that surprises you. But I do agree that I think that the fact that this conversation starts very late, and the fact that, I mean, I think this is not the case anymore, but I think it used to be the case that girls and boys were also separate when it came to sex education, for example, when not everyone got the menstrual talk. Well, I mean, this is very important, and if not just because you maybe have a female partner in the future, or you may have a daughter, or you may have a friend, but also to understand just how bodies work, right? This is part of it. So in a way, there is the level of period poverty, and that's like the social inequality issue, and I think everyone should be aware of that, because I think if you don't menstruate, to think of a short movie like that, it's very, very difficult to even think that that's the case. Like, why would you think that's the case? But also in terms of the personal, right, of saying like, okay, what kind of messaging am I giving my children or the people around me? But even for, like, when we talk about it with other friends, like, even the small comments, like, you know, okay, are you on your period because you're being, you know, very annoying, or you're being very sensitive now. And sometimes we just say it in passing, and it's not meant badly. But it's important to be aware that this is the kind of language we've been taught to use around the cycle and around premenstrual syndrome. And you know, where I see it switch, and this is also an age thing, of course, when couples start trying to conceive. And that's the moment when the menstrual cycle becomes important all of a sudden. So we ignored it for, like, you know, 30 years, and now men and women, let's say, assuming it's a heterosexual couple, and then suddenly it becomes something that actually the anxiety around the performance of the menstrual cycle, because it's very important now, ovulation, then you have to time. And I think that's such a disconnected way to think about the body, right? But that's, and then it's only about conception, and then it's only about like the creation and the fact that you have to have a perfect cycle. So indeed, I think it's important to start this much earlier, and to also explain that, that this is something you can talk about. But I have to say, when I introduced this topic to my brothers very, very early on, and I remember my youngest brother, I mean, this must have been 9 years ago already, or 8 years ago, that he told me that a group of his friends, like there was a party where there were two different people who were celebrating, one girl and one boy, and then the girl was supposed to get a box with some pads in it as well, but they got the gifts mixed up by mistake, and then the boy opened his box of gifts, and there were also pads in it, and there was a little panic around it. But the fact that he was able to tell me, like, oh, this happened, and he kind of smiled about it, made me think like, oh, this is also something that they can come to me about, and they are not making it a big fuss. And same with also other young people in my life saying like, oh, you know, my friend is very thin and she's not getting her period anymore. Because this is also something we don't realize, but I mean, teenagers, like, their menstrual cycle is very dependent on how much they're eating, and especially if they're struggling, for example, with eating disorder patterns. This is something that can affect their ovulation and therefore their menstruation. So this is especially for people that work with young people, this is an extremely important conversation. So yeah, I think we all have the work to do, whether you have a son or a daughter or just young people in your life. So thank you for your comment.
We have time for one last question, if there is one. I don't think there is one. That means we're going to wrap up the evening. I want to thank you, Maria Carmen, for taking your time and for sharing your important insights. Please give a warm applause. And thank you all for being here tonight, and hopefully see you at another event of Studium Generale. Have a nice evening.